Hello, and welcome to Fresh Blood, a podcast about killing it in the age of ageism, where we prove that new blood does not necessarily equal young blood. Here to discuss what it takes to have continued success through life, I'll be your host, Jolie Downs. With over 20 years of executive recruiting experience, I've learned how much we can grow and be inspired by other people's stories. I'm excited to share that with you here on Fresh Blood. Today, we are speaking with Richard Haiduck. Richard has led a long and successful career as an executive and mentor in the life sciences industry before he retired in 2019. He has since fulfilled his lifelong dream of becoming an author and has published his book, Shifting Gears: 50 Baby Boomers Share Their Meaningful Journeys in Retirement. He is amplifying the boomer retirement stories through his book, blogs, social media, and podcasts. He has become the voice of boomer retirement, and he is living his best life, fulfilling his long dormant goals, continuously learning through Stanford lectures and Zooms, staying active, and mentoring good work organizations. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to learning more about your story. Could you tell us a little bit about your own background and how you ended up doing what you're doing now?
Well, thank you, Jolie, for having me on the show. And let me maybe start at age 7, if that's not going too far back.
Tell us.
At age 7, I was convinced my life's work was to be an author. And I was kind of living the dream for about a year. Each day I would write a story. It was always some goofball thing about some fantasy or sci-fi or whatever. No story was longer than one page, but every day I'd do another story. And then, you know what happens with 7-year-olds. You're going along, and then all of a sudden you just say, no, wait, I want to do something else. So going outside to play baseball or go out and do something with my buddies became more important. And all of a sudden I wasn't on the path to be an author anymore, despite all the encouragement I got for it. 65 years later, I came back to the dream. I was talking to some buddies of mine, one of whom started to tell me this story about being in the Senior Olympics. And I'd known this guy for a really long time. And I said, how come you've never told me this before? And he said, well, I was kind of humble about it. I didn't want to brag about it. And I said, how'd you do? He says, oh, I won a medal. And I said, that story deserves to be told, don't you think? And anyway, so I had that experience 2 or 3 times over the next month. And I had this moment of saying, I used to want to be an author. Now I've got a chance to do it 65 years later. So that was a turning point.
What made you decide to go for it, though? I mean, we all have different ideas that come to us and that inspiration. What made you actually do it?
I think a couple of things. One was this longtime belief that I wanted to be an author. I read a ton of books, so I admire authors a lot. But I think probably the most important thing was, as I heard a few of these stories, I said, nobody's telling these stories. There's a vacuum out there. It was almost a marketing question of these stories need to be told, and I can devote the time and attention to finding those stories, interviewing those people, and drawing them out through an interview process. And as you know, as an interviewer, there's a certain set of skills that you need to get people to really open up to you. And I felt through my business career that I'd always been able to be open and honest with people, and that they always were able to tell me the way it really was, the way they really felt about things. So it was a combination of all of that.
And isn't it amazing how much you learn from the people that you interview too?
Oh, unbelievable. And some of these people were complete strangers. And some of the interviews, I tried to do the interviews in person or on Zoom, but some of the interviews were done just on the phone with a complete stranger. And as you'll see in the book, these people shared experiences that were very emotional to them, very gut-wrenching for them, very inspiring to them, and kind of put their hearts on the table and said, let me tell you how this was. And that was amazing to me, and surprising that people I had never met were willing to do that.
It's humbling, isn't it?
It is.
It really is. And it's there's so much that you get from having someone be open about their story. There's just so much that you yourself can learn and grow from someone else's honest and authentic story, um, which is what I.
I can already tell that you are a good and experienced interviewer and have that skill of listening. I kind of modeled myself after Terry Gross from NPR, and I would ask just an open question at the start. It became a standard question. How would you describe this stage of your life? And then I had a tape recorder running and I just shut up. And my first 3 or 4 questions, I always tried to make them things like, oh, really? Oh, why is that? Oh, tell me more. Instead of leading the witness, let them lead me wherever it goes. And and then at the end, I can edit. I can say what was the best of that and what are the things we want to keep. But where do you want to go in this conversation? Made it so amazing because I go to these places I'd never imagined they would talk about.
I love it. I know I love it. There's just so much out there that is worth talking about too. And everyone has that little special space, if you will. And what I found is that there's these underlying cores, big rocks, if you will, and then there's all these little rocks that everyone has inside of them. And I love collecting all of those little things and learning what it is that makes people tick and what makes them successful in life.
I think on one level this worked very well because people were willing to tell me their stories and their rationale for stories. On another level, at the end of my interviews, I had 800 pages of transcript. and I'm a first-time author, and I thought, I don't think my first book's going to be 800 pages. I got some work to do here.
It's interesting as a first time author. I mean, I'm sure there was so much that you had to learn in this process. I mean, how did you go about the whole process of doing something that was brand new to you?
Well, the interviewing part was where it started. And through my business career, I've had a lot of interactions with people, and I felt comfortable that I had the skills and that I could refine them by watching people like Terry Gross and other interviewers. So that part came naturally and easily and pretty early in the process. After that, it was a pretty steep learning curve. And the book industry is a very caring industry. There's so many people that will pull you aside and give you advice. I had 6 authors work with me to say, don't do this or pay attention to that. And so that part was good. I went to a writers' conference fairly early in this and just absorbed this enormous amount of information. And then also found an industry that was just really in transition because of Amazon and its effect. The rest of the people in the industry had to adjust to that. And so there was a little bit of turmoil. There was a little bit of things where people had to change the way they were doing their work. They had to change their behaviors, both of their organization and of themselves individually. So I kind of got into that. I just tried to listen carefully. I probably made a fair number of mistakes along the way. I know I made a fair number of mistakes along the way. But I would say trial and error and plenty of both.
So you just really threw yourself in and learned as you went, read up on things and taught yourself as you went along?
Yeah, I think there was a writers' conference last February, and that really helped. I just hung out with people and talked to them and heard presentations and met a lot of people, and just got a lot of advice. Some of it was conflicting, but if you get too much advice, you can figure out what's the good advice.
Yeah, so you took the best advice there and ran with it.
One of the things I found too is that the industry is flooded with manuscripts. And some of them are really terrific and some of them are really awful. And the agents and the publishers have to deal with this fire hose of stuff coming at them. And which of these are really going to make it? If you're doing Michelle Obama's book, you're pretty sure that's going to be okay. once you get below Michelle Obama and you have people who are doing their first book, how do you pick one? Um, and there was an element, I think, of being a first time author in my 70s. Is this a good bet? Um, and do I have a second, third, and fourth book in me? Do I have the energy? Do I have the social media connections? Um, I met with some people who I think were being very realistic about that. And they said, um, if I had this book written by a 20-year-old, it would be different than a book written by a 70-year-old. So it wasn't ageism. It wasn't discrimination. It was just being rational.
But this book is better being written from a 70-year-old.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's true. But for an agent or a publisher to invest in an author, they're looking at a long-term bet. And the first book, they probably won't make any money on. So unless there's a second book, they look at it with a little bit of skepticism.
So how do you deal with that?
I just went around it. I did the end run on it. I just, in the very early going, I had some people say, as a first-time author in your 70s, you're probably not going to get an agent at a publisher. You're probably going to have to self-publish. And I said, well, I'll go down the two paths in parallel. And I don't mind if I self-publish. I'd heard some pros and cons of self-publishing versus a big publisher. And then fairly early in the piece, I just got impatient and just said, I'm going to do this myself. And that's turned out to be a good decision at a couple of levels. When you do it yourself, you do it your way. Nobody tells you what the title is going to be and why what you picked is wrong. Nobody tells you which stories to include. Nobody tells you how long the book needs to be. And so you get to do the book that you want to do. That may be the best book or that may be the worst book, but it's your book. And that really mattered to me because I'm not doing this to make a living. I'm doing this more like a hobby that is something fun that I wanted to do. I wanted to share these stories, but I wanted to share the stories without diluting them from what I heard from the interviews that I did.
Which is what I love. I absolutely love the self-publishing industry and the ability to make this happen yourself and not have to bend to the stupid rules that some of the industry puts on us, which I completely disagree with personally.
I'm just going to say one other thing too is the backlog of agents and publishers and their processes is just abysmal. It takes a couple of years to get a book published in the best of times. When you approach an agent these days, or at least my experience was, they say, send me the stuff and not the whole book, send a chapter of the book so I can review it. And if you haven't heard from me in 6 weeks, that's a no. That's really weird. I don't know of another industry that has that kind of assume we're not going to do it because we have such a flood of things and we're too busy to get back to you and tell you that. I just think that's just wrong.
Yeah. And that's something you're putting so much heart and soul into something that you're throwing out there too. It's not just a resume.
Exactly.
Much different.
So I found myself saying, I waited for a few of these. I got some dialogue with some, but never really got close to either an agent or a publisher making a move that I liked. And I ran out of patience. I said, this is going to take too long and it's probably not going to work. And what's nice about being a retiree, you can shrug and say, well, that's not going to work. Let's try something else. And your ego is not wrapped in it. Your livelihood is not wrapped into it. You can just be rational about the decision and say, okay, that's not working. What am I going to do now?
Now, how amazing is that feeling, Richard? And how amazing would it be if we could learn that earlier in life?
I think that's really hard.
It's really
because
hard. That's why.
here's what I think. I think retirees have a luxury that is underappreciated, except by retirees, and it's called freedom. We don't have to do stuff we don't want to do. We don't have to, kind of have a boss that we're always kind of saying nice things to and making sure the person likes me and all that. We have an independence and a freedom and an ability to do whatever we want, however we want, as long as our health and our wealth holds up. If we're not broke and we're not sick, we can do whatever we want. And not break a law or something like that. You understand it. But we can choose what hobby we want. We can choose what volunteering we want. We can choose how we want to do a book. And as one of the guys I interviewed said so very clearly, we can do trial and error. And he was looking for the ideal volunteer position. And he says, I'm going to try one and see if I like it. I'm going to try another one. He went through 4 in a pretty short period of time until he found the one that was just right for him.
Oh, see, that's great. But
And he said, I couldn't have done that when I was working. You can't just kind of have a job and then quit and then have another job and quit. I mean, you can do it, but it's going to wreck your career most of the time.
no, you cannot do that with your career, but you can do that with volunteering, which can teach you about where you want to go in your career so that you make the correct choice.
So think of retirement as an iterative process. That you try it. If it works, you keep going. If it doesn't work, you do something else. If you think something was going to be fun, you do it. If you think something is going to stir your passions and make you feel good about yourself, try it and see. But I was in conversation with a lady the other day. She says, well, I really felt like I should volunteer. And this place I volunteer treats me like crap. And she says, but I want to volunteer. And my advice to her was, move on, lady. That's trial and error. You got an error. Go do another trial. There's plenty of places to volunteer, and you don't need to take it. You're a retiree. You've got freedom.
That's the freedom you get to enjoy.
Yeah.
Yep. No, and I think you can find avenues to that, even if you are earlier in life. Now, I'm curious, did any of your retirees start like a whole new direction once they did retire?
A bunch of them. One of my really favorite stories, and I shouldn't say I have favorites because I love them all, but this guy had been an Emmy Award-winning documentarian, and he'd made documentaries on a whole bunch of different subjects all around the world, doing a lot of different stuff. And he described it to me. He says, at one moment, he was always working for someone. They were always directing his activities, and he was winning Emmys for his bosses. And at one point, something he'd worked his heart and soul on under the direction of someone else, they decided to take it in a different direction. And he said, the only thing I could say about that was, oh, shit. He said, I just didn't want it to go that way. He says, that was the moment I decided I'm not doing this anymore. I'm an expert documentarian. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to do it solo. I'm going to find the subject. I'm going to do the interviews. I'm going to find the money to do it. And I'm going to do the subject that I want to do. And he picked a fairly controversial subject. He said, I'm going to go to Gaza and get the inside story on Gaza. And I'm going to do this story my way. And it was just, and then he goes on to describe what it was like to do the work in Gaza and how it felt to be doing it as an independent operator instead of as an employee. So he had adventures in Gaza, but he also had kind of the emotional part of I'm doing this on my own. And he really feels good about that. He was in a hotel one night and the building next door blew up. And so, like all good documentarians, he goes running outside with his camera and with his microphone and says, okay, who wants to talk to me?
You're crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing, he's lived a long and good life. And I said, this must have really scared you being there. He said, no. He said, it's going to be what it's going to be. The people who I work with as the people he interviewed, the people he stayed with, those sorts of things. Everybody's kind of looking out for me. He said, I'm not worried about the violence. I'm not worried about the bombs. He said, the thing that worries me the most is if I get sick, there's no good health care there. And going into the hospital would be just a horrible, horrible thing. So he says, I'm more in my 70s, I'm more worried about that than I am about a bomb. And I found that kind of interesting. I don't think I'd go to Gaza and stay in a place where the bomb blows up the building next door and not be worried about it.
Well, yeah. It's a different mindset, that's for sure. No, that's fascinating though. And I love that. I love that he just went and did it himself and put aside things that were bothering him, went after the things he loved, and made it all himself. That's wonderful. Is there any other great stories from your retirees that are worth sharing?
I think they're all worth sharing, but we don't have 4 hours. but here's another one. This guy was a career diplomat. He'd lived in New Zealand. He'd lived in a couple of places in Africa, and been all around the world working in embassies. And he had an opportunity to retire at age 50. And he said, I know the diplomatic life. I know there's things I could do. I could go to Washington and be a lobbyist, or I could hang around different places. He says, I'm not going to do any of that stuff. I'm going to reinvent myself completely. And he decided to form a business doing bird watching in Africa. So from being a diplomat, he became a CEO of a bird watching tour company in Africa. And he said, I knew I had to reinvent myself. I knew I had to have a fresh start. I knew I didn't want to keep doing stuff that was related to having been a career diplomat. And I've always loved watching birds. He says, as I've been posted at all these different places as a diplomat, every place I went out bird watching. And bird watching isn't for everybody. Some people love it. Some people would say, why would anybody do that? But it was a passion for him. And then the idea that he would build a business around that passion and do something that he felt so strongly about. So he reinvented himself. He said there were some things I had to learn about running a business, but he says it was not a lot different than running a department within the diplomatic corps. You had a budget, you had certain things you had to do, certain ways of interacting. And so he built this bird watching business, and loved it, and completely transformed himself.
Oh, that's great. I mean, you can learn anything you put your mind to. I love hearing people going after their passions in life. Now, you yourself, you've had a long career. I mean, you were in the life sciences industry for quite a while. You held numerous executive roles. You've written this book. What would you say has been your own greatest success, and what did you learn from it?
I consider my greatest success a process of kind of following my dream. And as I got older, that got easier to just say, what's right for my family, for me, what's right for having the right passions in my life, the right interests in my life, and not always having a single direction, So right now I'm mentoring social entrepreneurs in the developing world. So these are people trying to solve some social problem like poverty. I just finished working with an organization that is providing innovative shelter for refugees. What a rewarding thing to do. I've just so much loved that. And people with a real passion for doing that, but needed somebody with some gray hair to bounce some ideas off of. They'd say, oh, here's what we're going to do. I said, oh, really? Same interview technique. Oh, really? Oh, why is that? And they'd say, well, because I think that's the right thing to do. Well, how are you going to do it? Oh, well, we're just going to do it. Anyway, that has driven me. I do a lot of that kind of work now, in addition to doing the book. But I think the dream that I've achieved is that I've had a bunch of different things in my life, a great family, a wonderful wife of 52 years. And we just find a joy in all of this that is pervasive. And that's kind of living the dream. But there's not like a single thing, like I'm going to go climb a mountain. And after that, I will have accomplish my life's dream.
No,
I don't
that's
have a
beautiful.
single focused life dream.
It's how you're living your life. I love that. It's beautiful, and it's living a fulfilled life, and it's all the decisions you've made to build that fulfilled life. I think that's wonderful.
Yes.
What about the flip side of it? Can you tell me about a time that you dealt with a serious obstacle or failure or mistake and what you learned from it?
Within the book process,
Any process of life.
well, the book experience is most recent. So I think um, that process of figuring out after I had all these interviews in hand, um, figuring out what setbacks were permanent features of the landscape and what setbacks were things that could be worked through. I think the idea of getting one of the top 5 publishers to do the book um, was, I would call it an aspirational goal. I was saying, I don't know if I'll be able to do that, but I'm going to try. So I think that was a setback. But again, at this stage of my life, with this amount of freedom, it wasn't a setback that tore me up. It was a setback that I kind of thought it was going to be like that. I kind of thought I'd give it a try and see, but I had kind of a realistic sense that it probably wasn't going to happen. So it didn't crush me. It didn't surprise me. And the outcome of doing this in a self-published way has turned out to be able to move fast, move my way, and produce the book that I want to produce. So that doesn't sound like much of a setback, does it?
No, but that's how setbacks should roll, right? Take them in stride.
Yeah.
Learn from them, move on.
Right.
and you just keep moving, plugging forward until it turns into success. That's how we turn our failures into successes.
Right.
They're just little obstacles along the way.
So, Julie, and one other story that I think would be useful to talk through. This is a guy that had a very successful business career. As he was nearing retirement, he had all these ideas, all these plans. He said, "Oh, I'm strong and I'm healthy and we're not broke. I'm going to do all this wonderful stuff." And then he was diagnosed with cancer. And of course, that was devastating to he and his family. And he made some treatment decisions that turned out to be very right. And so his cancer came under control. But in the middle of the treatment process, he turned to one of the doctors and he said, you people have been terrific to me. I appreciate everything you've done to help me. What can I do to help you? And of course, his thought was, they're going to say, write me a check. I need money for the following. Well, they didn't. They said something else. They said, this community needs a cancer house. And he said, well, tell me more about that. He says, well, a cancer house is where a patient stays between treatments. It has to be either zero cost or very low cost, very affordable, that their families can stay there while they're being treated. And this community doesn't have that choice. It doesn't have a cancer house. Think of those kind of McDonald houses that are done near hospitals for kids' disease. So they said, if you could help us with that, that would be great. And this guy thought about it a bit, and he said, that would give me a sense of purpose in my retirement. I could accomplish something really important, very close to the heart after having been diagnosed with cancer. And I can do it my way. I can do it in a relaxed way with a major, major goal to accomplish. So he set about doing it. He organized volunteers. He organized fundraising. He organized all of the logistics of getting the approvals and the zoning and the hospital board to approve it and all that sort of thing. And over a multi-year time frame, he succeeded in raising more than $4 million, getting this cancer house up and running, and getting it to contribute to the community and the cancer patients in the community.
That's amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, and it was such a gratifying story. And the way he told it, he said, I've never felt like this on a project I've worked before. When I was, and he did a lot of neat things in his business career, but this one stands out to him. This is one where he did it his way. he had a relaxation about the project and yet an intensity for the project. He knew it was important, but he knew he was going to do it with a smile. He knew he was going to have a leadership approach that says, we're going to all pitch in together and have some fun with this, and we're going to do something great for this community. And he kept that as the tone of a very challenging project.
That's beautiful. And it all started with him turning to the doctor or the nurse and saying, "Thank you. How can I help you?" That's
Exactly,
really powerful.
exactly. And
That's really
that was a turning point in his life. That was a big deal.
Oh, I love that story. It just fills me all up. I love it. Uh, um, so let me ask you this: out of all of the things that you've done, because you have this successful career, and now you are fully rocking it in your, I'm going to use air quotes, retirement. What do you feel is key to continued success in life?
Well, I think the first answer is family. I think staying close with the family, having the kinds of relationship with kids and grandkids and a wonderful wife. I think that's a key element. It's a key stability around which all the other stuff can be built. I think in parallel to that, and in some ways separate from that, is to just keep adventuring and just keep saying, what do I want to do next? Now that I have the freedom to choose what I want to do. So I chose when I entered retirement to say, I really want to have a regular exercise program. I've always been too busy to do anything other than kind of bike rides on the weekend. I said, there's no excuse for that now. I can take a bike ride 3 days a week and get in better shape than I've ever been in my life. And that's a smaller example and maybe a trivial example, but it's a choice you can make to do it with freedom and matching the choices you want to make. And there's nobody breathing down your neck.
No,
There's
no,
nobody kind of saying it's going to be like this or you can't do that.
draft your perfect day each day if you want to.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So it's a wonderful time of life.
Yeah.
Wonderful time of life.
You're making me really look forward to it.
Okay, but Jolie, you got to promise two things: don't be broke and don't be sick.
I
Because if you're
know.
broke and you're sick, one or
It's
the
no
other, then it's not so great.
not
And
so great.
some of the people I've talked to had either a health or wealth problem, and they've had to be resilient about it. They've had to figure out a way to have the kind of retirement they want given those constraints. So the book, this interview has come off a little more joyful than the book. The book's got some people that went through really tough times and came out the other side, or are in the midst of coming out the other side. But the book is intended to be a cross section of people with a variety of experiences. One couple found their ideal retirement home, and I'll make this a very short story. It burned to the ground, and they had to bounce back. And the book tells the story of both their escape from the fire, which was terrifying by the sound of it, and they said wasn't terrifying at all. You just did what your instincts told you to do, and later you figured out you almost died. And then to bounce back from that and to have the resiliency and the getting over the anger and getting over the sadness of having lost your home, and then realizing it was just a home. Everybody lived. And that was kind of part of the resiliency process for them. So the book is filled with all sorts of different things, people at different stages, people at different activities, different challenges, and also different, there's some different spiritual things in there too. There's some people who, and I was completely surprised by that. I didn't think people would open up to me about those sorts of things. And again, I don't lead the witness. I let them talk about what they want to. But some people who had some really amazing experiences in discovering themselves and their peacefulness. One group of ladies, 5 girlfriends who had known each other basically all their lives, decided that they were nearing end of life. They're in their 70s, and they said, let's talk about it. Once a month, this group that's called OWLS, Old, Wise, Learning Still.
I
Once a
love
month. Yeah,
that.
isn't it great?
Yeah.
And so they get together and they just talk about a topic every month. Some of that is, how do you deal with death? How do you deal with deteriorating health? How do you deal with different things that are happening with your kids and your grandkids, or in some cases, great grandkids? And each month they have a different topic. They rotate who's the leader, and they deal with end of life. And in some ways it's kind of a downer, but in some ways it's a giant uplift that they're dealing with.
That's so important. They're a support system for each other. It makes everything that you're dealing with just a little bit easier to deal with because you have a support system. You're able to talk about it. You're able to vent about it. That's brilliant. I think we should all have those sister circles.
Yeah. And they said, sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, sometimes we just hold hands and look each other in the eye. But they're lifelong friends, and so the barriers were gone on the day of their first meeting. They could talk about anything, and there was nothing off limits. It was what's on your mind and what do we need to deal with. So I don't know if that's an upper or a downer or in between, but I do think it's instructive.
I think it's an upper. Like these are things that we all deal with, and it's just like with your book with the stories, like you said, they're not all upbeat, and that's important to be. None of our lives are all upbeat. No one's life is all upbeat, and it's important to be able to share in other people's stories, to learn from them, to know we're not alone, to feel less alone, feel a little more understood, and to be able to learn from other people's lessons so that maybe ours aren't quite as difficult.
And Julie, you touched upon something that I think is important for the book. There's a lot of really good books written about retirement that are what I would call prescriptive. They say, here's the way you retire. Here's the list of the 12 things you have to consider, and you pick this and you do that. And a lot of my friends told me, a lot of the editors I worked with said, you're going to have to draw some conclusions here. And I said, no, this is my book. I don't have to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have a book of stories, and people will, by inference, decide what that means to them. And so someone might read that story about owls and say, I don't connect to that. I don't really think anything about that. And somebody else might say, wow, I got to start thinking about that. That really hit home for me. But I don't tell them the answer. And I was tempted a couple of times to say, here's the lesson that this one teaches. I don't do that. I refuse to do that. And some of the interviews I'm having, people say, oh yeah, but didn't you figure out a whole bunch of things? And I said, yeah, and I'll share you my opinions with you. But it's not, if you want that in the book, don't buy this book. Don't buy this book if you want a formula answer to retirement. If you want to see some storytelling, you want to see some examples, you want to see a lot of people doing some fascinating stuff, then this is the book for you. But it's not prescriptive.
Yeah, those make great books because they may not be prescriptive from your words. The story themselves are.
Exactly right.
Yeah. You get your own answer that you need from them.
And then each person tailors that to themselves. And some people have said, well, this particular story didn't resonate with me. I said, well, that's why you turn the page. You go on to the other one. There will be, if somebody reads this whole book and doesn't come up with some that really, really resonate with them, I'll be stunned. Nobody has so far, but we're not, fully launched at this point. So.
Well, we will have a link to your book in the show notes, so anyone interested can easily find it. And so, but before we wrap up, Richard, I'd love to hear, is there anything that you've learned in life, or that one thing that you would share with listeners that would be the thing that could, maybe that one thing that could help them move just a little bit closer to their own success?
I would answer that with two answers. The first one is listen. Absorb what's around you, get the wisdom from those around you, but listen. And we're not doing that very well as a society right now. We're not listening to each other. And then I would say, no boundaries. Just, if you want to do something, think about how to do it, try it, be adventurous. That doesn't mean you have to climb a mountain. It might be that you just take a poetry course that you've always wanted to take. But be adventurous to those things that turn your passions on and give you the joy that you want out of life. And don't say no. Don't let anybody say no to that.
I completely agree 100%, Richard. It's fantastic. And that's the way you get things done right there. So, because at least the things that you want to get done.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It might not be what somebody else wants done. But
So thank you so much for sharing your story, Richard. I absolutely loved it and appreciate your time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julie. I enjoyed it.
I so enjoyed my talk with Richard and learning about the various stories of post-retirement. I found each one inspiring in its own way. With Richard's story himself, he rose through the corporate ranks, holding various executive roles and eased his way into retirement. What he touts as being his greatest success in life is what I believe to be key to having a successful life. It's the process of following the dream and loving and enjoying that process. At various stages through life, Richard took stock. He thought about what is right for me? What is right for my family? What are my current passions and interests in life? And then he allowed himself to follow them. He didn't hold himself to one single direction. He allowed his professional and personal interests to flourish. He enjoyed the process. He reveled in the act of life. This is what it's all about. It's not the end game. It's the actual playing of the game and loving it. And I think Richard embodied living that secret. When retirement came, he asked himself those questions once again. What's good for me? What's good for my family? And what came up was this long dormant dream from his childhood. I love this. And I'm sure that this happens to many. Times now available, desires and dreams are remembered, but too many leave it there and never take that step to manifesting that dream. Richard looked around, he saw others going after their goals, and he thought, well, why can't I? He stepped up to his dream and he started taking the steps to make it happen. And it's a process. Every dream is made up of a lot of little steps. And we should all be asking ourselves that question that Richard did. Why can't I? Richard decided to write his book. He conducted the interviews, he wrote, he edited, he learned everything he could about this brand new industry within a brand new craft. He made mistakes along the way, but he kept plugging away. He learned as he went. He gained as much as he could from conferences and other professionals in the industry. When he was faced with blockades that the publishing industry is riddled with, he did not allow that to stop him. He stepped around the problems created by an outdated system, and he published the book himself. I absolutely applaud this solution. I was inspired by all of the stories Richard shared from his book. I have to say, though, I absolutely loved the owls. Old, wise, and learning still. Oh, I have to say, I would love to see groups of owls in every community talking about the various topics of aging and supporting in dealing with those difficult topics of end of life. This is a brilliant idea that needs to be replicated. These topics, they shouldn't be taboo, and they are, and so often in our society. These discussions are needed. To find a shared, safe space for people to talk about these things would be an absolute gift. So much comfort in this system, and I truly would love to see this idea multiply everywhere. I can't get over how impactful we each have the power to be. I keep reflecting on the gentleman with cancer who had the absolute grace to turn to the healthcare workers and say, "Thank you. Thank you for all that you have done for me. Now, what can I do for you?" Wow. And when they answered, he listened. And they gave him a really big answer. Many people would think, well, what can I do about that? But here's the truth. You can do a whole lot. This gentleman, he heard the need for help and he stepped up. He had never done something like this before, but he rallied the volunteers. He got involved in fundraising, figured out the logistics, the zoning, and he ended up raising more than $4 million to get a cancer house up and running. In his retirement, it is impossible to measure the impact of this one person making something like this happen. His actions will have lasting consequences on countless families during a time when it is most needed in their lives. It is so very powerful. What's even more so, we all have the ability to make such an impact. I loved Richard's description of his retirement, and I have to say, I really hope that I feel the same way when I'm in his position. He is loving the independence and freedom to do whatever he wants in his retirement. The ability to choose whatever hobby, whatever passion to follow, whatever volunteering appeals, the ability to be exactly where it's right for you. I reflect on this and I realize that there is freedom that I won't know or understand until retirement. But we do also have the choice to start implementing some of these things into our lives now. We don't have to wait for it all. And we should all be stirring up our passions, regardless of what decade we're living in. It does not matter our age. We should all be asking the same questions. What would you try if you had all the time in the world? What would you learn? What would you do? Start making that list. Then make yourself a promise to carve out just a little bit of time each week for yourself. And focus on one thing in your list, just one. We all owe it to ourselves to do this. And I know how hard an idea this can be when you have kids or work or extracurriculars, taking care of aging family members, other family responsibilities. But really, where there is a will, there is a way. And the bottom line, we deserve to enjoy our passions before retirement. Now, however, I have to say, if you are in retirement, I really hope this is how you are spending your days. I hope every day is the pursuit of the perfect day. I hope you are following your passions. I hope that you are helping others with your own unique abilities. And I hope that you are living a life that is joyful and fulfilling in every way. Until next time. Thank you for spending time with us on Fresh Blood. If you love this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, or giving us a review. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again on the next episode.